What you're about to witness will shake you to your core and then lift your spirits in ways you never expected. Because this is the story of how one grieving widow's quest for simple respect turned into a nationwide movement that brought down an entire network of corrupt police officers who thought they were untouchable. Mrs. Grace Adebayo had just buried her husband of 35 years, Detective Samuel Adebayo, a decorated police officer who had dedicated his life to serving his community with honor and dignity, when she walked into the police station to collect his personal belongings and pension paperwork. A routine procedure that should have taken 20 minutes but instead became the catalyst for the most shocking exposé of police corruption this decade has ever seen. But before we dive into this incredible story of courage, justice, and the power of standing up to bullies in uniform, make sure you smash that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because Axiom USA brings you the stories that matter most, the ones that expose truth, deliver justice, and prove that even in our darkest moments, righteousness can prevail. Trust me when I tell you that what Mrs. Adebayo does in this story will leave you cheering, crying, and sharing this video with everyone you know. Because this isn't just about one widow's fight. It's about how ordinary people can take down extraordinary corruption when they refuse to stay silent. Grace Adebayo wasn't looking for a fight that cold Tuesday morning in Detroit. She was simply a 62-year-old retired teacher who had spent the last week planning her husband's funeral, comforting her children, and trying to navigate the overwhelming grief that comes with losing your life partner. Samuel had been more than just a husband. He was her best friend, her confidant, and a man who had spent 30 years walking the beat with integrity, earning respect from both his colleagues and the community he served, even as he quietly documented the racist behavior he witnessed within his own department. What Grace didn't know as she walked through those precinct doors, clutching her husband's death certificate and wearing her best black dress out of respect for the institution he had served so faithfully, was that she was about to encounter the very corruption that Samuel had been secretly fighting against, and that her response would trigger a chain reaction that would reach all the way to the FBI, the Department of Justice, and the front pages of every major newspaper in America. The officer behind the desk that day was Sergeant Rick Morrison, a 20-year veteran with a history of complaints, a reputation for racism, and an ego so massive that he genuinely believed his badge made him untouchable. But he had no idea. He was about to mess with a woman whose quiet strength had been forged through decades of teaching inner-city kids, raising 4 successful children, and supporting a husband who had faced discrimination his entire career while never losing faith in the possibility of change. What happened next wasn't just disrespectful. It was so shockingly cruel and blatantly racist that it would have been unbelievable if it hadn't been captured on the precinct's own security cameras. Because Sergeant Morrison, in his infinite stupidity, decided that this grieving black widow was the perfect target for his twisted sense of humor and deeply ingrained prejudice. Grace Adebayo walked into the Detroit Police Department's 12th precinct wearing her late husband, Samuel's favorite dress, a simple black number that he always said made her look like royalty. Carrying nothing but his death certificate, their marriage license, and a heart full of grief, completely unaware that she was about to encounter Sergeant Rick Morrison, a racist bully who was about to make the biggest mistake of his career and inadvertently expose a corruption network that had been poisoning the department for decades. Morrison looked up from his desk with the kind of disdain usually reserved for criminals, took one look at Grace's dark skin and modest appearance, and immediately assumed she was just another welfare case, looking for a handout, completely ignoring the official paperwork she placed respectfully on his desk, while she quietly explained that she needed to collect her deceased husband's belongings and process his pension paperwork. "Lady, this ain't the welfare office." Morrison sneered with a laugh that made Grace's stomach turn. "And we don't just hand out dead cops stuff to anyone who walks in here claiming to be somebody's widow. You got any proof you're actually married to this guy?" Grace, despite the shock of such disrespect, maintained her composure with the dignity that had made her one of Detroit's most respected teachers, and calmly pointed to the marriage certificate and death certificate on his desk, but Morrison barely glanced at them before launching into a tirade that would soon be quoted in federal court proceedings. "Look here, sweetheart," he said with a smirk that would haunt his nightmares for years to come. "I don't know what kind of scam you're running, but Detective Samuel Adebayo was a good cop, a real cop, and there's no way a man like that would..." be married to someone like you, so why don't you take your fake papers and get out of here before I have you arrested for fraud? What Morrison didn't know was that Grace had been recording their entire conversation on her phone, not because she expected trouble, but because Samuel had always taught her to document everything when dealing with official business, a habit that was about to save her dignity and destroy Morrison's career. Grace's voice never wavered as she looked Morrison dead in the eye and said with the quiet authority of someone who had spent 40 years commanding respect from rowdy teenagers, "Sergeant Morrison, my husband spoke of officers like you. Officers who brought shame to the badge he wore with pride. And I want you to know that Samuel documented every racist incident he witnessed in this department, and those records are now in the hands of people who actually care about justice." The color drained from Morrison's face as he realized this wasn't some random woman he could bully and dismiss. But the precinct secretary, Officer Jennifer Martinez, chose that exact moment to walk up to the desk, took one look at the paperwork, and gasped, "Mrs. Adebayo, oh my goodness, I'm so sorry for your loss. Detective Sam was one of the finest men I've ever worked with, and we're all devastated by his passing." But here's where this story takes a turn that will blow your mind. Grace wasn't just carrying her husband's death certificate that day. She was also carrying a flash drive containing 30 years of Samuel's secret documentation of police, corruption, racism, and cover-ups, and she was about to use Morrison's cruelty as the perfect opportunity to expose it all. Morrison's face went from pale to bright red as he realized he had just publicly humiliated the widow of one of the department's most respected officers. But instead of apologizing, he doubled down on his stupidity by threatening to have Grace arrested for disturbing the peace, which was exactly the wrong thing to say to a woman who had just spent a week being comforted by FBI agents, federal prosecutors, and civil rights attorneys who had been working with Samuel on a massive corruption investigation. Officer Martinez looked mortified as she tried to apologize for Morrison's behavior, but Grace held up her hand with a smile that was equal parts gracious and terrifying. "Don't apologize for him, dear. Some people reveal their true character when they think no one important is watching, and Sergeant Morrison has just shown everyone exactly who he is." Meanwhile, other officers in the precinct had noticed the commotion and were gathering around, including Captain James Wilson, Morrison's supervisor, who had worked alongside Samuel for 15 years and considered him a close friend and mentor. When Captain Wilson realized what was happening, his expression went from confusion to horror to barely contained rage, because he knew that Morrison had just disrespected not only a grieving widow, but also the memory of one of the finest officers the department had ever seen. "Morrison, what the hell is wrong with you?" Wilson barked with the kind of command authority that made grown men tremble. "This is Detective Adebayo's widow, you absolute fool, and you just disrespected a woman whose husband died serving this community while you were sitting behind a desk eating donuts and harassing citizens." But Grace wasn't finished with Morrison yet, because she pulled out her phone, showed him the recording of their entire conversation, and announced loud enough for everyone to hear, "Sergeant Morrison, you asked for proof that I was married to Detective Samuel Adebayo. So let me give you proof that will satisfy even someone with your limited intelligence and moral capacity." She then pulled out the flash drive that Samuel had entrusted to her before his death, the one containing years of documented evidence about corruption in the department, and handed it to Captain Wilson with a statement that sent shockwaves through every corrupt officer in the building. "Captain Wilson, my husband spent 30 years documenting racist behavior, evidence tampering, and corruption in this department, and this drive contains enough evidence to send dozens of officers to prison, starting with Sergeant Morrison, who is mentioned by name in at least 15 separate incident reports." The silence that followed was deafening as every officer in the room realized that their careers, their freedom, and their futures might be contained on that tiny piece of technology, and Morrison's face went through a rainbow of colors as he understood that his moment of racist cruelty had just triggered the exposure of secrets that were supposed to stay buried forever. What happened next didn't just destroy Morrison's career, it triggered the largest police corruption investigation in Detroit's history, and the dominoes that started falling would eventually reach all the way to the mayor's office, the FBI, and a network of corruption that had been operating for decades. Captain Wilson, who had always suspected that corruption existed in his department but had never been able to prove it, immediately called for the precinct to be locked down while he contacted Internal Affairs, the FBI, and the Michigan State Police because he knew that the evidence on that drive would require federal intervention to properly investigate and prosecute. Morrison, meanwhile, was desperately trying to backtrack and apologize, claiming he had been having a bad day and didn't mean any disrespect, but Grace cut him off with the kind of withering look that had made thousands of her former students straighten up and pay attention. "Sergeant Morrison, my husband always said that a person's true character is revealed in how they treat people who can't fight back, and today you showed everyone that you're exactly the kind of officer who brings shame to this badge." Within hours, news of the confrontation had spread throughout the department. The media had picked up the story, and federal investigators were examining Samuel's documentation with the kind of enthusiasm usually reserved for Christmas morning, because the evidence was so comprehensive and damning that it provided a roadmap to corruption that had cost the city millions in wrongful conviction settlements and destroyed countless innocent lives. The beauty of Grace's approach was that she never raised her voice, never lost her dignity, and never stooped to Morrison's level, but instead used his own racism and cruelty as a weapon against the very system that had protected him for so long, proving that sometimes the most powerful response to hatred is simply refusing to be diminished by it. Morrison was suspended within 24 hours, arrested within a week, and ultimately sentenced to 8 years in federal prison for his role in evidence tampering, civil rights violations, and conspiracy charges that stemmed directly from Samuel's documentation and Grace's courage in exposing it all. The flash drive contained not just evidence of Morrison's misconduct, but detailed records of a corruption network that included judges, prosecutors, and city officials who had been working together to cover up police brutality, plant evidence, and target minority communities for harassment and false arrests. Over the following months, Grace became an unlikely hero and advocate for police reform, testifying before Congress, working with the Department of Justice to implement new oversight procedures, and establishing the Samuel Adebayo Foundation for Police Accountability, which provides legal support for victims of police misconduct and training for officers who want to serve with integrity. But the most beautiful part of this story isn't just that justice was served, it's how Grace transformed her grief into a movement that has prevented countless other families from experiencing the pain and injustice that she and Samuel fought against their entire lives. 18 months later, the Detroit Police Department had been completely restructured under federal oversight. 43 officers had been fired or prosecuted, and the city had implemented new policies for handling citizen complaints, officer training, and community relations, all because one grieving widow refused to let a racist bully disrespect her husband's memory. Morrison, serving his sentence in federal prison, reportedly told other inmates that his biggest regret wasn't the crimes he committed, but the moment he decided to mock a woman whose quiet strength and moral clarity were more powerful than any weapon he had ever carried, because that decision had cost him everything while elevating her to a platform where she could create lasting change. Grace still lives in the same Detroit neighborhood where she and Samuel raised their children, but now she travels the country speaking about police reform, working with families who have lost loved ones to police violence, and proving that sometimes the most effective activism comes not from anger or hatred, but from a refusal to let evil triumph over good. The precinct where Morrison humiliated her now has a memorial dedicated to Detective Samuel Adebayo and other officers who served with integrity, and Grace often visits to remind young recruits that the badge represents not power over others, but service to the community and protection for those who cannot protect themselves. And perhaps most satisfying of all, Morrison's racist mockery of a grieving widow became the catalyst for reforms that have made policing more fair, more accountable, and more just for everyone, proving that sometimes the darkest moments in our lives can become the foundation for the brightest changes in our world. And that's the power we all have when we refuse to let hatred and injustice have the last word.